The sky was clear that afternoon, the kind of blue that made people forget anything bad could happen. Then a boy went over the edge of the school roof, arms out, mouth open in a scream nobody below seemed to hear. Students on the ground floor looked up. A few pointed. Nobody ran forward. Nobody screamed for help. They just watched him fall, the way people watch a leaf drop, curious but untouched, as if his body hitting the pavement wouldn't be their problem at all. His name was Kim Hyun Seong, and in the half-second before he hit the ground, his mind was oddly calm. He wasn't thinking about the fall. He was thinking about how none of them had moved. To understand why he ended up on that roof, the story has to go back further, to the very first day someone decided he was worth nothing. Hyun Seong grew up in a small town called Dan, raised by his grandmother after his parents died young. He had one younger brother, Hyun Jin, gentle and quiet, the kind of kid who cried when he stepped on ants by accident. Money was always tight. His grandmother worked long hours just to keep both boys fed and in uniforms that fit. He wasn't the strongest kid at school, and he wasn't the smartest either. He was ordinary, in the way most people are ordinary, and ordinary was exactly what made him a target. It started small, a shove in the hallway, a stolen lunch. Then it grew, the way rot grows in wood nobody checks. A gang of older students, led by a boy named Park Men-chul, decided Hyun Seong was fun to hurt. They beat him behind the gym. They forced him to hand over money his grandmother had scraped together for rent. When he tried to tell a teacher, the teacher looked the other way. That teacher was Kim Hyun Seong, his homeroom instructor, a man who smiled at parents during meetings and pocketed bribes the moment they left the room. Wealthy families paid him to keep their sons' violence off the record. He took the money without blinking. Every bruise on Hyun Seong's face was just another line item Kim Hyun Seong chose not to write down. There was one person who never looked away. Kim Se-woo had known Hyun Seong since they were small enough to share a single umbrella on rainy days. He was a taekwondo athlete, quick-tempered, loyal to a fault. When he found out what was happening, he tried to fight back on Hyun Seong's behalf, more than once, and paid for it with his own bruises. He never once suggested Hyun Seong should just accept it. He kept showing up, kept sitting beside him at lunch when everyone else moved to the far table, kept walking him home even when it meant getting jumped himself. It wasn't enough. The abuse didn't stop. It escalated, until the day Hyun Seong found himself standing on the edge of the school roof, 4 boys behind him, laughing about something that wasn't funny at all. He didn't jump, he was pushed. And that was the fall the story opened on. The blue sky, the upturned faces, the silence where screaming should have been. He didn't die. That would have almost been kinder. Instead, he landed in a hospital bed and stayed there, locked inside a body that no longer answered him, for the next 10 years. Here is the detail almost nobody in his life ever learned. Hyun Seong was awake the entire time. Not physically, not in any way the doctors could measure, but somewhere behind his closed eyes, he could hear everything. He heard the machines. He heard the doctors murmuring about a coma with almost no chance of recovery. And worse, he heard his family. His grandmother visited every single day for the first 2 years. She held his hand and talked to him about nothing, about the weather, about a customer at the market who reminded her of him. Later, her voice grew tired, thinner, worn down by hospital bills that never stopped arriving. His brother Hyun Jin grew up mostly without him, carrying a quiet grief that never had anywhere to go. He gave up his own dream of studying science and instead buried himself in exam prep for the police academy, determined to one day find out exactly who had put his brother in that bed. He never got the chance. Meanwhile, the boys who had thrown him off that roof went on with their lives untouched. Park Men-chul graduated. Kim Hyun-chul kept collecting his quiet bribes. Nobody paid for what had been done. Somewhere out there, hidden behind names Hyun Seong hadn't even learned yet, an entire organization had profited from his suffering, and it kept right on operating, chewing through other kids the same way it had chewed through him. 10 years is a long time to lie still and listen to your own life fall apart around you. By the time the 10th year came, something in Hyun Seong had gone quiet in a different way. Not asleep, finished. He felt his own consciousness thinning, like a candle burning down past the wick, and in what felt like his final moment, he let go of all of it. The anger, the fear, the 10 years of listening without a voice. Then he opened his eyes, and he was 15 years old again. Sunlight was coming through a window he hadn't seen since he was a freshman. His body felt wrong in a way that took him a second to place. It felt light, strong, uninjured. He sat up too fast and nearly fell out of bed, his hands shaking as he touched his own face, his own arms, searching for the decade of scars that should have been there and weren't. He didn't trust it. He pinched the skin on his wrist hard enough to bruise, and the pain was sharp and immediate and real. This wasn't a dream. Somehow, impossibly, he was back at the exact point where everything had gone wrong, with a mind that still remembered every year that hadn't happened yet. Here's what nobody around him understood, and what the viewer should hold on to from this point forward. The boy walking to school that morning looked exactly like the same weak freshman everyone remembered. But inside, he was carrying 10 years of pain, 10 years of watching corrupt men profit off cruelty, and 10 years of memorized headlines about scandals that hadn't happened yet. Every bully who dismissed him as an easy target was about to find out how wrong they were. They just had no way of knowing it yet. The date on the calendar told him something that made his stomach turn. This was the exact day his friend Lee Jong-min was first beaten by Park Min-chul's gang, the very first crack in a wall of cruelty that would eventually swallow his whole life. He remembered it clearly because he'd once stood by and done nothing, too scared to get involved. Not this time. He found them behind the gym, exactly where memory told him they'd be. Jong-min was on the ground, arms up to shield his face, while Park Min-chul stood over him, grinning at his friends like this was some kind of performance. Hyun Seong didn't hesitate. He walked straight into the group, grabbed Park Min-chul by the collar, and hit him hard enough to knock him flat on the ground. The gang froze. Nobody had ever seen this version of Hyun Seong before. In their memory of him, he was the quiet, breakable freshman who flinched at raised voices. This one didn't flinch. This one hit back like he'd been waiting years to do it. Which, in a way, he had. Park Min-chul got up spitting blood, furious and humiliated in front of his own crew. He swore this wasn't over. Hyun Seong believed him. He knew exactly how far this fight would eventually go, and he knew Park Min-chul was only the smallest piece of a much bigger machine. But every machine starts somewhere, and this was where he intended to start tearing it apart. Word of the fight reached the school office by lunch. Hyun Seong was called in, and Kim Hyun Seong sat across from him with his usual practiced patience, the same tone he'd once used to lecture a broken, frightened boy about not causing trouble. This time, Hyun Seong looked back at him without a trace of fear. He knew things about this man that shouldn't have been possible for a freshman to know. He knew about the envelope of cash Kim Hyun-chul had accepted from Park Min-chul's father 3 years ago in the original timeline, the same bribe he was almost certainly about to accept again. He knew about a woman named Mrs. O, a colleague at another school, and about hotel receipts that were never meant to surface. He laid it all out calmly, watching the teacher's confident expression crumble piece by piece. Kim Hyun-chul's hands were shaking by the time Hyun Seong finished talking. He asked, in a low voice, how a 15-year-old could possibly know any of this. Hyun Seong didn't answer that question. He simply told the man what he wanted instead. Protection, silence, and a blind eye turned in his direction from now on, the exact opposite of what this teacher had once given his tormentors. It wasn't trust. It was leverage, cold and simple, and Kim Hyun-chul understood the trade immediately. He agreed. From that day forward, the man who once sold his silence to bullies for money was going to sell it to their victim instead, and he would do it for free, out of fear. One shield in place wasn't enough. Hyun Seong needed something stronger than a frightened teacher, something the school board couldn't intimidate. He needed a name with real weight behind it, and he already knew exactly whose name that would be. Ko Chang-bom was the reckless eldest son of Mong Jin Construction, a boy with a short temper and an even shorter list of people who liked him. In Hyun Seong's original timeline, Chang-bom had once been arrested after a brawl outside a convenience store, a fight that wasn't entirely his fault, but that nobody bothered to prove otherwise. Hyun Seong remembered the exact night it happened. He made sure he was standing outside that same convenience store when it did. The fight broke out exactly the way he remembered. A group of drunk men picking a fight with Chang-bom over a parking dispute, throwing the first punches while claiming afterward that he'd started it. Officers arrived and hauled Chang-bom into the station, and this time, Hyun Seong walked in right behind him, holding up his phone with dashcam footage he had quietly downloaded from a nearby shop earlier that day, footage that showed the entire fight from start to finish. The footage cleared Chang-bom of every charge within the hour. He walked out of that station a free man, staring at the skinny high schooler who had somehow known exactly where to be and exactly what to bring. He asked why a stranger would go out of his way to save him. Hyun Seong told him simply that he needed a favor someday, and this was an investment. Changbom laughed at that, hard and genuine, the first real laugh Hyun Seong had heard from an adult in longer than he could measure. Something about the audacity of it appealed to him. That single favor became the seed of an alliance that would eventually reshape Hyun Seong's entire war. But it needed to grow fast, because he wasn't the only one with future knowledge working against the clock. Somewhere inside Mongjin Construction, Changbom's younger brother was already plotting to seize control of the company for himself, and if that coup succeeded the way it once had, Hyun Seong would lose his most valuable ally before their partnership had even begun. He found Changbom again within the week and told him flatly that his own brother was planning to push him out of the family business, backed by 2 board members Changbom still trusted completely. Changbom's first reaction was disbelief, then anger, then a slow, cold understanding, as Hyun Seong laid out details that lined up too precisely to be guessed. Dates, names, a meeting that hadn't happened yet but would, in a private dining room Changbom hadn't even booked. There was a construction site collapse coming too, Hyun Seong told him, one that would kill workers if certain corners kept getting cut for profit. He said Changbom had a choice standing in front of him that his father would remember for the rest of his life: save money or save people. He told him which one would actually win his father's respect. Changbom listened to all of it in silence, jaw tight, and for the first time didn't argue. Something about the way this teenager spoke, calm and certain, like a man who had already lived through the ending, made him choose to believe him. He chose the workers. He chose the truth about his brother. And when the coup attempt finally surfaced weeks later exactly as Hyun Seong had described it, Changbom was already prepared, already one step ahead of men who thought they held every advantage. His father watched him handle the crisis with a steadiness nobody in the family had seen from him before, and something in the old man's eyes changed. Back at school, Hyun Seong's protection was still fragile. Kim Hyun Seong stayed quiet out of fear, but fear only worked on individuals. The real threat was coming from higher up, from a school board that had grown comfortable ignoring violence as long as the right envelopes kept arriving. A parent-teacher association meeting was scheduled, one where Park Men-chul's family and 2 other wealthy households intended to bury the entire incident behind the gym for good, painting Hyun Seong as the aggressor instead. He needed his shield to walk through that door with him. He sent one message to Changbom, and Changbom sent one word back. The night before the meeting, Hyun Seong barely slept. He kept running through everything that could go wrong, the same restless calculation that had once kept him awake for 10 motionless years inside his own skull. His grandmother knocked on his door around midnight, worried about the bruises on his knuckles that he hadn't managed to explain. She sat on the edge of his bed and told him, quietly, that whatever was happening, she wasn't going to lose him again. She didn't know what she meant by again. He did. He almost told her everything right then. The fall, the coma, the 10 years of her voice growing tired beside his hospital bed. He didn't. Instead, he just told her he was going to make things right, and she squeezed his hand the way she used to when he was small enough to believe that promise, without needing proof. The next morning, the meeting room filled with parents in expensive coats, murmuring about a rowdy scholarship student who had apparently attacked their sons without provocation. Kim Hyun Seong sat at the front, sweating, saying nothing useful, exactly as Hyun Seong had instructed him to say nothing useful. Park Men-chul's mother stood up first, voice sharp, demanding an apology and a formal punishment. Hyun Seong stood alone at the center of the room, and for one long moment, it looked like the same old story was about to repeat itself. A friendless kid about to be crushed under the weight of money and connections. Then the door opened. Shin Young-min operated differently than the boys Hyun Seong had faced so far. He didn't throw the first punch himself. He sent others to do it, and stayed just far enough back that nothing ever traced to him directly. That was how the Golden Circle worked at the regional level, Hyun Seong knew. Deniability was the whole business model. He found Young-min's trail through one of Se-woo's new recruits, a quiet transfer student who'd once been forced to pay protection fees just to walk to class without incident. The kid didn't know Young-min's full name at first. He just knew there was an older boy from another district who collected money from smaller students on behalf of someone higher up, and that anyone who refused ended up in worse shape than a simple beating usually caused. Hyun Seong tracked the payment route backward over 2 weeks, patient in a way that surprised even Coach Yun, who'd expected his newest student to come in swinging the moment he had a target. Instead, Hyun Seong watched, mapped names, learned the schedule of collections, and waited for the exact right moment to strike where it would matter most. He found Young Min alone outside a convenience store near the district border, flanked by only two lower-ranking enforcers instead of the usual crowd. Young Min looked him over with the bored contempt of someone used to being the most dangerous person in any room he entered. He asked, almost lazily, if this was the freshman who'd been causing trouble in Dan. Hyun Seong didn't answer with words. He'd learned enough from Coach Yun by now to know that hesitation cost more than it saved. The fight that followed wasn't clean or fair, and it wasn't meant to be. Young Min was bigger, stronger, and trained in ways his two lackeys weren't, landing a solid hit early that split Hyun Seong's lip open. But months of brutal conditioning had changed what Hyun Seong's body could absorb and give back, and he fought the way Coach Yun had drilled into him, economical, relentless, aiming for the joints instead of the face. He broke Young Min's arm below the elbow, a clean, ugly snap that dropped the older boy screaming to the pavement, while his two enforcers scattered rather than risk the same fate. Hyun Seong stood over him afterward, chest heaving, and told him this was only the interest on a debt that was about to come due in full. Young Min, cradling his ruined arm, spat out that Hyun Seong had no idea who he was really working for, that people far above his pay grade would hear about this by morning. Hyun Seong told him calmly that he was counting on exactly that. What came next wasn't just about breaking an arm. Hyun Seong understood something about people like Young Min that most of his victims never grasped. Reputation was the only currency that mattered to a broker. Take away the fear people had of him, and the rest collapsed on its own. Over the following days, word spread through Young Min's old network that the untouchable senior had been beaten by a freshman and left crying on the pavement. Hyun Seong made sure of it, feeding the story through exactly the right channels, letting it grow with each retelling the way rumors always do. Students who had once paid Young Min out of fear started testing the boundaries themselves, small acts of defiance that would have been unthinkable a month earlier. The final humiliation landed in the school cafeteria, orchestrated quietly by Hyun Seong through students Young Min had once bullied without consequence. A boy barely half his size, still wearing glasses too big for his face, walked up to Young Min's table in front of the entire lunchroom and poured a carton of milk slowly over his head. Another spat directly into his tray. Young Min sat frozen through all of it, arms still in a cast, surrounded by students who used to flinch at the sound of his name and now just stared, some of them laughing. He didn't fight back. He couldn't. Word had already spread that Hyun Seong was watching, and nobody wanted to find out what happened to people who crossed him twice. Weeks later, in an ending Hyun Seong hadn't personally arranged but didn't feel much sympathy for either, Young Min was stabbed during a dispute with one of his own former victims outside a convenience store. The same kind of casual violence he'd once profited from turned back on him by someone he'd broken too many times. He survived, but the message rippled through the entire regional network. The broker everyone feared had been humiliated by a freshman and then discarded by his own city like garbage nobody wanted to claim. Hyun Seong felt no satisfaction watching it happen. He'd expected to. Instead, he just felt tired. The same bone-deep exhaustion he remembered from his coma, and a growing certainty that this war would demand more of him yet before it was finished. He was right. The Golden Circle didn't send another broker next. It sent something worse. His name was Cho Tae-jun, and he transferred into Hyun Seong's school 2 weeks after Young Min's humiliation went public, enrolling under a story about relocating for his father's work. Nothing about his file matched. Not the address, not the previous school records, not the quiet, watchful way he studied every hallway like he was mapping exits. Hyun Seong recognized what he was almost immediately. Young Min had been a broker, a middleman who paid others to do the actual violence. Tae-jun was the violence itself, a B-rank operative trained specifically to eliminate problems the Golden Circle couldn't solve through bribes or intimidation anymore. He was here to kill him. Hyun Seong had known this moment was coming, somewhere in the back of his planning, but knowing it and facing it were different things entirely. Tae-jun didn't act like a student. He moved like someone counting distances, watching angles, studying Hyun Seong's daily patterns with the patience of a professional waiting for the right moment when nobody else would be around to witness what happened next. Se-woo noticed it too, faster than Hyun Seong expected. He'd grown sharper over the months of training, more alert to the kind of quiet danger that used to slip past him entirely. He told Hyun Seong flatly that the new transfer student felt wrong, that something about the way he watched people made his skin crawl, and Hyun Seong didn't bother denying it. Facing a trained assassin alone, even with months of brutal conditioning behind him, wasn't a fight Hyun Seong was confident he could win. So he didn't plan to fight alone. He gathered the small faction Se-woo had been building in Dan, a dozen students who owed him loyalty for problems he'd already solved, and laid out a plan that relied on numbers instead of pride. They cornered Taejun in an empty classroom after hours, using a fake message about a missing textbook to lure him there without raising suspicion. When he realized what was happening, his expression barely changed, a professional calm that unsettled even Se-woo standing at Hyun Seong's side. The fight that followed was nothing like the scrappy alley brawls that had come before it. Taejun moved with brutal efficiency, dropping 2 of Hyun Seong's students in seconds each, strikes placed to disable rather than simply hurt. For a moment, watching his allies fall around him, Hyun Seong felt something close to the old helplessness, the same paralysis that had once kept him silent for 10 years. Then he remembered exactly why he couldn't afford to feel that again. He used the numbers the way Coach Yoon had taught him to use anything he had available. Not evenly, but strategically, forcing Taejun to divide his attention across multiple angles at once while Hyun Seong circled toward his blind side. It cost him a cracked rib and a knee that would ache for weeks afterward, but he got the opening he needed, driving Taejun's arm against a desk hard enough to break it in the same clean way he'd broken Yang Min's. Taejun went down for the first time, breathing hard, staring up at a group of high schoolers who had somehow outmaneuvered a trained operative on his own turf. Hyun Seong crouched beside him and told him plainly what came next. He knew the organization Taejun worked for, knew roughly how it ranked its operatives, knew that a failed B-rank assassin exposed by teenagers wasn't someone the Golden Circle would forgive easily. He offered him a choice most people in his position never got: become useful or become disposable. Taejun's carefully blank expression cracked for the first time since he'd arrived. He asked quietly how a freshman knew so much about an organization most adults had never even heard of. Hyun Seong didn't answer that question directly. He simply told him that he already knew what the Golden Circle did to operatives who failed twice. It wasn't loyalty that turned Taejun into a double agent that night. It was survival math. Cold and simple, the same kind of calculation Hyun Seong understood better than almost anyone alive. Taejun agreed to feed him information from inside, reporting back on assignments before they happened, buying himself time and buying Hyun Seong a set of eyes inside an organization that had, until now, remained mostly invisible to him. It was through Taejun, weeks later, that Hyun Seong finally learned something that had been bothering him since this new timeline began. In his original life, he'd always assumed the Golden Circle simply chose him at random, one unlucky student among many caught in their business model. Taejun's information suggested otherwise. Someone had specifically paid for a contract targeting Hyun Seong personally, long before Park Men-chul ever threw the first punch behind the gym. Someone had wanted him hurt badly enough to pay for it. He spent days turning that fact over, running through every classmate, every interaction from his old life that might explain it. The answer, when it finally surfaced, wasn't what he expected. It came from a financial record Taejun managed to pull, a transfer routed through several shell accounts before landing, eventually, in a fund controlled by the family of a classmate named Oh Hee-ji. Hee-ji was wealthy, quiet in class, the kind of girl teachers praised for her manners and other students mostly ignored. Hyun Seong barely remembered her from his original life, if he remembered her at all. He couldn't understand what a girl like that would want with hiring the exact organization that had once ended his future. He got his answer through careful, patient digging, cross-referencing old-school records with something Taejun mentioned almost in passing, a rejected confession, months before the bullying ever started, back in his original timeline. Hee-ji had approached Hyun Seong once, quietly, with feelings she'd never told anyone else about. He'd turned her down gently, the way most teenagers turn down confessions they aren't ready for, and thought nothing more of it. She had thought about it constantly. Her family's money had given her a lifetime of getting whatever she wanted without much resistance, and rejection from an ordinary boy with no money and no status had apparently curdled into something ugly enough to reach for real violence. She hadn't asked for him to be embarrassed or excluded. She'd asked for him to be broken, and she'd paid enough to make it happen slowly, over years, dressed up as ordinary schoolyard cruelty so nobody would ever trace it back to a heartbroken teenage girl with a checkbook. Hyun Seong confronted her alone, away from the hallways where witnesses might complicate things. He laid out everything he knew, flatly, without dressing it up. He watched her face go through disbelief, then fear, then something colder, as she realized exactly how much he'd uncovered. She didn't deny it. She told him, almost proudly, that she'd never expected someone as unremarkable as him to actually find out, and that even now, knowing what she'd done, she didn't feel the guilt he probably wanted to see on her face. Hyun Seong struck her, once, hard enough to leave a mark that wouldn't fade for days, a reaction that wasn't part of any careful strategy, just 10 years of buried fury finally finding a target that deserved it. He told her afterward that her father would hear everything, every transaction, every shell account, unless certain conditions were met immediately. Her father, when confronted separately with the same evidence, didn't argue either. He paid to make the exposure disappear quietly, and in doing so bankrupted a significant portion of his own company, covering legal fees and settlements Hyun Seong made sure stayed just visible enough to matter. Hye-ji's social standing collapsed almost overnight once whispers of the scandal leaked despite her father's best efforts, leaving her isolated in hallways she'd once ruled without effort, friendless in a way money couldn't fix. It should have felt like closure, finding the person who'd started it all. Instead, it left Hyun Seong colder than before, staring at a girl whose entire motive had been nothing more than wounded pride. All those years, all that suffering, traced back to something this small and this petty, made the whole architecture of his old life feel even more grotesque than he'd already believed it was. With Hye-ji exposed and the regional network in Dan largely dismantled, Hyun Seong understood the fight couldn't stay small much longer. Everything he'd uncovered pointed toward Seoul, toward Gangnam specifically, where the real architects of the Golden Circle operated behind boardroom doors instead of school hallways. He arranged a transfer to an elite academy there, one that catered to exactly the kind of wealthy families who funded organizations like this one. It meant leaving behind the safety net he'd built in Dan, leaving Se-woo in charge of holding the town steady, and walking directly into territory controlled by people with far more resources than a corrupt homeroom teacher and a handful of angry teenagers. He knew what waited for him there wouldn't be solved by breaking one arm at a time. The academy in Gangnam looked nothing like the school Hyun Seong had left behind. Glass hallways, uniforms tailored instead of bought off a rack, students who spoke about stock portfolios the way other teenagers talked about video games. Everything about the building was designed to remind visitors that money lived here, comfortably, and had for a long time. Hyun Seong walked through the front gates alone on his first day, carrying nothing but a bag, and the calm certainty of someone who already knew how this story was supposed to end. He didn't know, exactly, who among these polished students answered to the Golden Circle. That was the problem. In Dan, the enemy had names he recognized from memory. Here, the syndicate wore better clothes and smiled more convincingly. It didn't take long to feel the difference. By his second day, he noticed the same 3 students always positioned somewhere nearby, never speaking to him directly, just watching. By his 4th day, his locker had been broken into, nothing stolen, just enough disturbed to make the message clear. Somebody wanted him to know he was being watched. He'd expected isolation. What he hadn't fully expected was how coordinated it would feel, like an entire ecosystem had been quietly instructed to freeze him out. Group projects mysteriously filled up before he could join. Conversations stopped when he approached. Even teachers seemed oddly reluctant to call on him, as though someone above them had suggested it was safer not to draw attention his way. This was the Golden Circle operating exactly the way it was designed to, not through fists in an alley, but through slow, deliberate social erasure, the kind of pressure that broke people without ever leaving a mark anyone could photograph. Hyun Seong had lived through worse. He let the isolation happen without fighting it directly, using the quiet instead to study the school from the outside in, mapping which families sat on the board, which teachers seemed unusually protective of certain wealthy students, which names kept surfacing in conversations he wasn't supposed to overhear. The provocations, when they finally came, were carefully engineered to look like his fault. A shove in a crowded stairwell that left another student sprawled and crying, staged just convincingly enough that 3 witnesses were already prepared to blame Hyun Seong before a teacher even arrived. He recognized the setup immediately. The same fingerprints he'd seen behind Yongmin's old operation, just wearing a more expensive disguise. He let himself get caught in the trap on purpose. It was a risk, and he knew it. Getting formally blamed for an incident like this could mean expulsion, could end the entire operation before it started, could hand the syndicate exactly the ammunition they needed to remove him quietly and legally. But Hyun Seong had learned something important in the months since his return. Sometimes the only way to expose a trap is to let it close partway, and then use it against the people who built it. He came prepared for the disciplinary hearing the syndicate had clearly expected to be a formality. Instead of arriving alone and unrepresented, he walked in with a private attorney secured quietly through Changbom's corporate connections, a sharp, unbothered woman who dismantled the fabricated witness statements piece by piece, exposing inconsistencies the syndicate's coach students hadn't anticipated anyone bothering to check. The board, expecting an easy expulsion, found themselves instead facing the very real possibility of a defamation lawsuit if they proceeded without solid evidence. Hyun Seong's lawyer made that risk explicit, calmly, in front of everyone present. The meeting ended not with a punishment, but with a quiet, humiliating retreat from administrators, who had clearly been told this would go differently. It was the first crack in Gangnam's confidence, and Hyun Seong made sure it wasn't the last. He organized something the syndicate hadn't planned for either: public attention. Working with a few sympathetic students he'd carefully identified during weeks of quiet observation, kids who'd quietly suffered under the same kind of pressure campaigns without ever having the resources to fight back, he helped coordinate a small but visible protest outside the school gates, banners raised against unchecked bullying and administrative silence. It wasn't a large protest, it didn't need to be. A handful of local reporters, tipped off through a contact Changbom arranged, showed up to cover it, and suddenly an elite academy that thrived on discretion found its name attached to headlines it desperately didn't want. Somewhere above the school, in an office Hyun Seong hadn't yet identified by name, people were starting to pay very close attention to the freshman who refused to disappear quietly. He felt it in the atmosphere around him almost immediately. The subtle harassment stopped being subtle. Students who'd once ignored him started openly hostile, shoving past him in hallways, muttering things meant to be heard. Se-woo called him most nights from Dan, worried, asking if he needed backup already. Hyun Seong told him not yet, though privately he wasn't certain how much longer that would remain true. The certainty didn't last long. It was Tae-jun who warned him first. A short message sent late one night through a burner number they used only for emergencies. The organization had decided Hyun Seong was no longer a manageable problem. They were done with legal maneuvering and public embarrassment. The order had come down for a direct strike, something large enough to end this permanently, arranged to happen off school grounds where there would be fewer witnesses and far less accountability. Hyun Seong read the message twice, sitting alone in the small apartment Changbom had quietly arranged for him near the academy. Outside his window, Gangnam's skyline glittered the way it always did, indifferent to what was about to happen beneath it. He thought about turning back, just for a moment. He thought about how much simpler it would have been to stay small, to stay hidden, to let the syndicate believe it had won, and quietly build his revenge from somewhere safer. Then he thought about his grandmother's tired hands, about his brother giving up his own future chasing an answer he never found, about 10 years of silence nobody should have had to survive. He wasn't going to hide from this. He was going to make sure it happened on his terms instead of theirs. He called Se-woo that same night, and for the first time asked him directly to bring everyone. Every student they'd trained in Dan, every ally who'd chosen to stand with him instead of walking away, all of it, into Seoul, into a fight that was about to become far bigger than either of them had originally planned. Se-woo didn't hesitate. He simply asked when. The location the syndicate chose was a luxury high-rise under construction near the edge of the district. A building with enough empty, unfinished floors to make sure whatever happened inside stayed contained and unseen. Hyun Seong recognized the choice for what it was, an execution staged to look like an accident, a collapsed scaffold, or a tragic fall that would raise no real questions from anyone with the money to bury them. He walked toward that building 3 days later with a small group of allies at his back, knowing full well the numbers waiting inside would badly outmatch them. Somewhere above, watching from an office he still hadn't managed to identify by name, the true architect of the Golden Circle was about to learn exactly how badly he'd underestimated the boy he thought he'd already broken once before. The construction site stood empty of workers by the time Hyun Seong arrived. Every legitimate crew sent home early under some excuse nobody would ever bother investigating. Steel beams rose unfinished into the night sky, floors open on all sides, wind moving freely through spaces that weren't supposed to hold anyone yet. He counted the numbers waiting for him before he even reached the entrance. More than he'd expected. Enforcers positioned on multiple floors, watching from shadows the way Taejun had once watched him in a classroom, except there were dozens of them now instead of one. Se-woo stood beside him, along with a dozen students who'd trained under Coach Yun over the past months. Kids who'd started this war as easy targets and become something else entirely through sheer stubborn repetition. None of them were professionals. All of them had chosen to be here anyway. The first wave came from the second floor, dropping down through an open stairwell with the kind of coordinated speed that told Hyun Seong these weren't hired thugs picked up off the street. These were trained operatives, similar in build and discipline to Taejun, sent in numbers instead of alone this time. The fighting that followed was nothing like the schoolyard brawls that had come before it. Hyun Seong felt the difference in the first exchange, a strike that clipped his shoulder and nearly numbed his entire arm, delivered by someone who clearly knew exactly where to hit a body to shut it down fast. He rolled with it instead of absorbing it head-on, a trick Coach Yun had drilled into him through weeks of getting it wrong first. Around him, his small army fought in pairs and trios, exactly as Se-woo had organized them during hurried practice sessions back in Dan. One student went down hard early, dragged clear by two others before the enforcers could finish what they started. Hyun Seong heard the scream and felt the old paralysis threaten to creep back in, the same helplessness that had once kept him frozen for a decade. He pushed it down and kept moving. They were losing ground floor by floor. Numbers alone made that inevitable, but numbers weren't the only thing that mattered in a fight like this. And Hyun Seong had spent 10 years learning patience, even when everything in him wanted to rush forward. He spotted the one enforcer who moved differently from the rest, calmer, more deliberate, clearly ranked above the others despite carrying no obvious markers. A short blade caught the construction lights as the man drew it, the first weapon to appear all night, and Hyun Seong understood immediately that this was the true threat sent to finish things properly. The man came at him fast, blade low, aimed to disable rather than kill outright, at least at first. Hyun Seong dodged the initial slash by a margin thin enough to feel the air move past his ribs. The second came faster. He didn't dodge that one. He caught it instead, both hands closing around the blade itself as it drove toward him, steel biting into his palms deep enough to draw blood immediately, deep enough that pain should have made him let go. He didn't let go. He remembered Coach Yun's warning from months earlier, about fighters who crossed into territory beyond ordinary self-preservation, and understood now exactly what the coach had meant. He held the blade in place, blood running down his wrists, and twisted with everything his exhausted body had left. The steel snapped clean, the sound sharp and strange against the noise of the fight still happening around them. He drove his forehead forward into the man's face before he could recover from the shock of watching his weapon break in a teenager's bare hands. The enforcer went down. He didn't get back up quickly, and the men around him, watching a 15-year-old snap a blade with nothing but raw will and bleeding hands, hesitated for the first time all night. That hesitation was enough. Se-woo rallied the rest of the group behind him, pressing the advantage, while the syndicate's confidence cracked for the first time since the ambush began. What had started as a controlled execution devolved, floor by floor, into a retreat nobody had planned for, enforcers pulling back toward exits as word spread that whatever this operation had walked into wasn't what they'd been told to expect. By the time it ended, Hyun Seong stood alone near a shattered window on the fourth floor, hands wrapped crudely in torn fabric, watching the last of the syndicate's men disappear into the streets below. His allies were battered, several needing real medical attention, but every one of them had walked in on their feet, and every one of them was walking out the same way. It wasn't a clean win. It wasn't supposed to be, but it was loud enough, public enough, chaotic enough that the Golden Circle could no longer pretend this was contained, controllable, invisible. Somewhere above all of it, the man who had ordered this attack was about to discover exactly how expensive that mistake would become. Hyun Seong had known the name Yoon Hun Min for longer than anyone realized. In his old life, that name had meant nothing to him, just another face in business headlines his family could never afford to care about. It was only through Taejun's careful, dangerous digging inside the syndicate structure that Hyun Seong confirmed what his future memory had only half remembered, that the sociopathic, brilliant heir of the Dayuan group wasn't just connected to the Golden Circle. He was the Golden Circle. Every regional broker, every academy contract, every quiet arrangement selling academic advantage through violence. All of it eventually funneled upward into networks Hyun Min personally controlled, hidden behind layers of shell companies and untouchable family wealth. Exposing a man like that couldn't happen through broken arms or beaten enforcers. It required something Hyun Seong had been quietly assembling since his earliest days back in Dan. Patient alliances built with people who had both the power and the motivation to act once the evidence became undeniable. He'd reached out months earlier to a reformist senator named Kim Pan-woo, a man who'd spent years fighting corruption cases that mysteriously kept collapsing before trial. He'd found a deputy prosecutor named Kang Dong-cho, sharp and stubbornly incorruptible in a system that usually punished people for staying that way. To both of them, Hyun Seong fed pieces of evidence gathered through Taejun, through broken brokers, through financial trails his future knowledge helped him trace faster than any ordinary investigation could have managed. He told Senator Kim Pan-woo something during their first real meeting that mattered more than anything else he could have said. He told him he welcomed the strictest possible application of the law, even against his own methods, even against the blackmail and violence he'd used to survive this far. He wanted this done clean, he said, because clean was the only version that would actually hold once it reached people with enough money to make dirty evidence disappear. The senator hadn't fully understood the weight of that promise at the time. It would matter enormously later. The media blitz that followed the high-rise incident moved fast, faster than the syndicate's usual damage control could contain. Reporters who'd covered the small protest outside Hyun Seong's school suddenly found themselves handed a much bigger story, an anonymous tip leading them toward financial irregularities inside the Daewon Group that traced, eventually and unmistakably, back to Hyun Min's private accounts. Hyun Min didn't panic the way lesser men might have. He was brilliant, genuinely so, and he moved to contain the damage with a coldness that unsettled even the people working to bring him down. He tried isolating witnesses. He tried burying records. He tried, at one point, ordering one final strike against Hyun Seong personally, a desperate attempt to remove the center of the storm before it swallowed him completely. That attempt failed too, intercepted through information Taejun fed forward just in time. Another quiet reminder of how thoroughly Hyun Seong had already dismantled the syndicate from the inside before most of Seoul even knew its name. It was Hyun Min's own father who finally ended it, faced with evidence too public and too damning to bury any longer. Rather than watch decades of legitimate business reputation collapse alongside his son, the elder Yoon made a choice that shocked the business world almost as much as the scandal itself. He stripped Hyun Min of his corporate inheritance entirely, cutting him out of the company that bore the family name, and had him quietly committed to a high-security psychiatric facility under a diagnosis that conveniently kept him out of criminal court and permanently out of public life. Whether that diagnosis was genuine or simply the most convenient outcome for a family protecting its remaining reputation, nobody outside that decision ever fully learned. What the public did learn was enough. The man once whispered about as the invisible architect behind a nationwide bullying syndicate disappeared behind locked doors, and the empire he'd built without ever showing his face began collapsing without him. With Hyun Min removed from the board entirely, the structure he'd spent years building didn't collapse overnight. Organizations like the Golden Circle rarely die from a single blow. They bleed slowly, piece by piece, as the people who once depended on the man at the top scramble to save themselves instead of protecting a sinking operation. That scramble was exactly what Senator Kim Pan-woo and Deputy Prosecutor Kang Dong-cho had been waiting for. The evidence Hyun Seong had spent months quietly assembling, clean, verifiable, untouched by the blackmail and violence he'd used everywhere else in his war, became the backbone of a case too solid for the usual tricks. Money couldn't make it disappear this time, because none of it had been gathered the way money usually corrupted these things. Every account trail, every falsified school record, every bribed official's paper trail had been documented through legitimate channels, exactly the way Hyun Seong had promised the senator it would be. It still took years. Corruption this deep didn't unravel in a season. Kim Pan-woo used the momentum from the scandal to run for higher office, campaigning openly on dismantling networks just like this one, networks that had quietly poisoned schools and courtrooms alike for a generation. Hyun Seong watched his old ally's career rise from a distance, careful never to attach his own name publicly to any of it, understanding that a 15-year-old with too much visible influence would raise exactly the wrong kind of questions. By the time Kim Pan-woo became president, The special task force he launched on his first year in office had a roadmap already prepared, built from years of evidence that had been sitting ready, waiting for someone with enough authority to finally act on all of it at once. The purge that followed reached further than even Hyun Seong had expected. Corrupt prosecutors who'd spent careers burying cases like this one found their own records exposed instead. Politicians who'd taken quiet payments to protect academies running Golden Circle contracts lost their seats, some of them facing charges that stripped away decades of carefully built respectability in a matter of months. The organization that had once seemed untouchable, woven into the fabric of the country's elite institutions, came apart thread by thread until almost nothing recognizable remained. Kim Hyun Seong's fall came earlier than most, and far harder than he'd ever anticipated. The homeroom teacher who had once smiled his way through bribe after bribe, who had watched children get beaten and chosen silence every single time, was arrested not long after the Gangnam scandal broke, his name surfacing in financial records tied to nearly a dozen different bullying cases across 3 different schools. He tried, during his trial, to paint himself as another victim of circumstance, a man simply doing what everyone else in his position did. The judge wasn't moved, neither was the public, watching a case that had become a symbol of everything wrong with institutions meant to protect children, instead abandoning them for money. He was sentenced to a maximum security facility, and prison, it turned out, held its own particular judgment for men like him. Inmates who'd grown up on the wrong side of systems exactly like the one he'd profited from didn't extend him any sympathy once word spread about what he'd actually done for a living outside those walls. He spent his sentence enduring exactly the kind of casual, repeated cruelty he'd once ignored in others, stripped of every ounce of authority that had once let him pretend his silence was harmless. Oh Hae-ji's punishment looked different, quieter, but no less permanent in its own way. Her father's company survived the scandal, barely, gutted by settlements and legal fees that left the family fortune a fraction of what it once was. Hae-ji herself never faced criminal charges. Her age and her family's remaining influence saw to that. But money alone couldn't buy back what she'd actually lost. The other students at her school, once eager to be near her simply because of what her name represented, drifted away the moment that name stopped meaning anything worth associating with. She finished her final years of high school largely alone, sitting at tables nobody chose to share, carrying a reputation that followed her out of every classroom and into every social circle that mattered. She had once believed that money could buy anything, including a boy's affection or, failing that, his suffering. She learned, slowly and completely, that some things it couldn't buy back once they were gone. Not every ending settled quite so neatly. Somewhere in the chaos surrounding the collapse, a teacher named Chang Wang-gi, someone who'd worked adjacent to the syndicate's school contracts without ever being fully implicated herself, reported seeing a vice principal carried out on a stretcher during the height of the investigation's most intense weeks. What exactly happened to that vice principal, whether it was the pressure of interrogation, an attempt to escape accountability, or simply an unrelated medical emergency that arrived at the worst possible moment, never became fully clear. It remained one of the few loose threads the collapse left behind, a small unanswered question in a story that otherwise closed almost every door it opened. For Kim Chang-bom, the outcome ran in the opposite direction entirely. His steady handling of the construction collapse crisis, his refusal to let his younger brother's attempted coup succeed, and his quiet, consistent partnership with Hyun Seong through some of the most dangerous months of the entire war had earned him something he'd spent years failing to win through temper and bravado alone. His father named him chairman of Mongjin Construction outright, passing over the more conventional, more polished executives who'd assumed the position would naturally go to someone else. Chang-bom never forgot who had helped make that possible. He became, in the years that followed, Hyun Seong's primary corporate backer, funneling resources and protection through legitimate channels long after the more dangerous parts of the war had ended. An alliance that had started with dashcam footage outside a convenience store and grown into something neither of them had originally expected to last. Cho Tae-jun's path forward was murkier, the way defectors' paths usually are. He never faced formal prosecution, his cooperation quietly protected by arrangements Hyun Seong negotiated on his behalf through Kang Dong-cho's office in exchange for testimony that helped convict several higher-ranking operatives. He disappeared from Hyun Seong's life not long after the syndicate's collapse, choosing to rebuild somewhere far from Seoul, somewhere nobody would recognize the face of a former B-rank operative who'd once been sent to kill a teenager and ended up helping take down the organization that trained him instead. Se-woo stayed in Dan through all of it, exactly as he'd promised, holding the town steady while Hyun Seong's attention moved toward bigger battles. He never became famous the way Changbom did, never sat on any boards or gave any interviews. He simply kept training, kept watching over the small network of students who'd once relied on him, and kept showing up at Hyun Seong's side whenever things in Seoul got dangerous enough to need him there. He was the one person, across 2 entire lifetimes, who had never once needed a reason to stay loyal beyond simple, uncomplicated friendship. Hyun Seong understood, more than almost anything else he'd fought for, that a bond like that was worth protecting as fiercely as any piece of evidence or any corrupt official's downfall. His grandmother lived to see almost none of the darker parts of what her grandson had actually been doing during those years. Hyun Seong made sure of that deliberately, keeping the worst of it far from her, letting her believe instead that his sudden toughness and his new, wealthy friends were simply strokes of unlikely good fortune. What she did see was enough to ease years of worry she'd carried since he was small. Medical bills that no longer arrived. A grandson who came home late sometimes, bruised sometimes, but who always came home, steady and present in a way she hadn't quite let herself hope for, after everything the family had already survived. His younger brother Hyun-jin grew up in this new timeline almost entirely untouched by the tragedy that had once consumed his future. Free from the burden of chasing justice nobody would give him. Free from watching his older brother lie motionless in a hospital bed for a decade, he pursued exactly the path he'd once given up in Hyun Seong's original life. He tested into a prestigious science-focused school, the kind of institution that had once been nothing but a discarded dream, and Hyun Seong made absolutely certain, through every quiet resource he had access to, that nothing would ever threaten that future the way his own had once been threatened. By the time the last remnants of the Golden Circle finished collapsing under the weight of President Kim Pan-woo's task force, Hyun Seong was no longer the frightened, isolated freshman who'd once been thrown from a rooftop while the world watched and did nothing. He'd become something the syndicate never accounted for when they picked an ordinary orphaned boy as an easy, forgettable target. He'd become the reason the entire structure no longer existed. He didn't seek out public recognition for any of it. He never gave interviews, never let his name attach itself publicly to the scandal that had reshaped the country's approach to institutional corruption. He moved instead into a quiet position behind the scenes at the newly reformed Mongjin construction, working alongside Changbom on projects that had nothing to do with revenge and everything to do with simply building something worth building. There was one afternoon, sometime after the last major conviction had finally worked its way through the courts, when Hyun Seong found himself walking alone through a busy street in the middle of the city, no particular destination in mind. The crowd moved around him the way crowds always did, indifferent, ordinary, entirely unaware of what this quiet young man walking among them had actually done to reshape the world they lived in. He stopped without quite meaning to, somewhere near the center of a wide intersection, and sat down on a low concrete ledge, letting the noise of the city wash over him. And for the first time since he'd woken up 10 years in his own past, he cried. It wasn't grief, not exactly. It wasn't triumph either, not the way he might have imagined it would feel back when he was still trapped, silent and motionless, in that hospital bed listening to his family fall apart around him. It was simply release, the slow unclenching of something he'd been carrying for what felt like 20 years across 2 separate lives, a weight he hadn't fully realized was still pressing down on him until it finally, quietly, lifted. People walked past him without noticing, the same casual indifference that had once let a boy fall from a roof without a single hand reaching out to stop it. This time, the indifference didn't hurt the way it once had. This time, it simply meant the world had moved on, and he was finally, genuinely, allowed to move on with it. He thought briefly about the version of himself who never got this chance, the one who spent 10 years paralyzed and conscious, listening to his grandmother's voice grow tired, and his brother's dreams quietly die. He thought about how close he'd come to becoming nothing more than a name in a hospital record, another statistic, in a system that had failed him at every possible turn. He wasn't that boy anymore. He'd made sure, deliberately and completely, that nobody else would have to become that boy either, not on his watch, not while he still had the strength and the knowledge to stop it. The Golden Circle was gone. The men who'd built their fortunes on other people's suffering were scattered now. imprisoned, institutionalized, or simply erased from the positions of power they'd once treated as untouchable. His grandmother slept peacefully most nights now, free from the financial dread that had once followed her everywhere. His brother studied science instead of criminal justice, chasing curiosity instead of vengeance. Se-woo still called him most weeks, usually about something small and unimportant, the kind of ordinary conversation that had once felt impossible to imagine having again. Hyun Seong wiped his face, stood up from the concrete ledge, and let himself disappear back into the crowd, just another face in a city that had no idea what it owed him, and no need to ever find out.